who was his audience, and then looking at the structure. How does he structure as a whole his entire message? So we're going to do big picture stuff, and then next week we'll dive into chapter 3. All right? All right. So, well, let me get bearings on my notes here. Excuse me. So the first question, if you're looking at the top of this little class sheet there, what can we know about when and how and to whom the gospel according to Matthew was written? So a couple of little points to begin with. It's important to say at the beginning that we can only make educated guesses. So when it comes to time frames for most of the New Testament, or almost all the books of the Bible, we're just doing guesses, educated guesses, right? There's no exact dates to them, but educated guesses about when these kinds of writings were done. And we should not base our faith on the answers that we recently find, right? So I got to tell you, because this is important, because at the seminary we had one professor of the New Testament. He almost took it as doctrine that Matthew was the first gospel written, and that if you disagreed with him, or if you thought it was Mark, which most other people do, including me, he would not think very highly of that. He was that convicted of that. It had to be Matthew. It's not that big of a deal, right? But he was an Eric Keel. I never had a work class. I stayed away from that because he was so convicted by that. Okay? But most conservative scholars tend to agree that it's okay to disagree on these matters. Right? So we don't have any of the original copies of the New Testament as well. You realize that, right? We don't have original copies of any books of the Bible. By original copies, I mean the one that Matthew actually wrote himself. We don't have it. There's no way that we could have that, right? So we cannot say for sure who wrote it and who it was written by, because he never does like Paul in his letter says, this is Paul, an apostle of Christ. The gospel writers don't do that. They don't say, hey, I'm Matthew, I'm writing this gospel. We only know back as far as evidence can take it.
So why do we think they're gone? Because they would have had to...
The original manuscripts?
Yeah. They would have had to have had them at one point.
There's only one.
You're saying the books, all of them.
Any of the books of the Bible.
Right. They would have had to have had them at some point.
Matthew had written.
To be able to
copy it.
Right. So where did they go after that?
It might still be found yet.
Yeah,
they still might. Yeah. But the reality is we don't even have a full, there isn't, the oldest manuscripts of the New Testament date to the 2nd century.
Okay.
Documents were made out of papyrus, which is not it's a very fragile substance.
They would crumble.
Yeah.
Was it the Dead Sea Scrolls? So those are copies then?
Those were copies. The Dead Sea Scrolls were copies of the Old Testament. Yeah. And even those are fragmented, right? And they got preserved in a cave in clay jars. And that was their being able to be preserved, if you will. Yeah. So, and a lot of the documents got destroyed in wars and fires.
Yeah.
Actually the Muslims of Alexandria, Egypt saved most of the ancient manuscripts that we have. They were very knowledge-based people, and they preserved a lot of them. So we don't have any of the ancient stuff. Yeah. But what we do have are very reliable, and we've got more. There are more copies of the early manuscripts and portions of them than any other literature in the world, right? So like Homer and all the Greek philosophers and their stories, we don't have any of those original manuscripts either. And the ones that are still there are not as well preserved or as numerous as the New Testament ones are. Okay. So those are great questions, yeah. But that all what we're saying is we don't got to doubt, right? We don't have to doubt that what we do have is the scriptures, because it's what God has handed down to us. But we just don't have originals. So nor can we say, so it's hard to say exactly when this was written. And we can't, there's not 100% sure that it's got to be Matthew, because he never names himself in it. But what we do have is that, what we do have is that early church fathers and the earliest writings that we have of Christians attributed this gospel to Matthew. That makes sense? Okay. So a couple things about who this dude is and when he's writing. Matthew doesn't tell us who he is. But there is a few things that we can say about who could be Matthew. So if you look at the third paragraph there, it says, only the gospel according to Matthew specifically names the name of Matthew when he calls a specific tax collector to follow him. So Luke will tell the same story, and Mark tells the same story of the calling of a tax collector by Jesus to come and follow him. But in Luke and in Mark, the tax collector is named Levi. Okay? But in Matthew, he's named Matthew, which is not uncommon for people to have a Hebrew name and a Greek name. Right? And Matthew is the only one who, in his gospel, wanted to call. And so a lot of writers or scholars think that that's kind of a signal that he's telling you, yeah, he is the author. He's using his name Matthew instead of Levi. Okay. So the best guess that we have of who wrote this gospel is a tax collector from Capernaum who would have been a man by the name of Matthew. He's the human author of the gospel. Who's the real author of all the gospels? God's Spirit. But Matthew is the human author. Best that we can tell, and I think it is. I think it's Matthew, the tax collector from Capernaum. Now, if you've ever watched the movie Jesus of Nazareth, I've shown clips of it in here before for some of our studies. It's the one that was done in the 70s. It's 6 hours long, or over 6 hours long. So it's a long one, right? You're not going to watch it in one sitting, most likely. Back in the day when I was a kid, and then even when my kids were little, TNT and TBS, they used to show it during Holy Week. They would show it 2 hours at a time during the week of Holy Week. And the one scene where, who else is from Capernaum? Jesus calls to be followers.
Peter.
Simon Peter. Yes, Simon and Andrew and James and John. They're also from Capernaum. And
Because it's on the water.
it is. And they're fishermen. And Capernaum's a pretty major village there. Well, we know that Matthew is the tax collector there. And so they have a scene. Now, it's contrived. It's not necessarily historically accurate, but it's very, very possible. We know what kind of viewpoint would have the people had of tax collectors.
Very cool.
Yeah, they were, because you collaborated with Rome, right? That was, the fact that they took your money was bad enough, right? But that they were collaborators with Rome in
They
doing
were like
this.
traitors to their
Exactly. Traitors to their people, because they collaborated with Rome and they took their money. And the way that you made money as a tax collector was, if Rome wanted 5 shillings, they charged you 8 shillings. Rome got its 5, no problem there. They kept the 3, or whatever they decided, right? So they became very wealthy that way as well. So they were very looked down upon. And so there's this scene in the movie, which is based on, the miraculous catch. When Jesus calls Simon Peter, they're out in a fishing boat. They haven't fished. They fished all night. Jesus says, let's go back out after he teaches. Throw the net, and they go, really? As they throw the net, what happens?
Still, they can't hardly get it in the boat.
They can't get it in the boat. All their boats are filling. And Peter comes back, Simon comes back with all of his boats filled, and guess who's on the shore waiting for them? Matthew. He's looking at this fish going, oh, you got quite the take today, huh, Simon? Contriving, I'm going to have a big tax bill for you soon, right? And Simon hates him. Simon hates him. And after Jesus calls Matthew, come follow me, what does Matthew do? He throws a party. He throws a big party at his house. Of course, who's going to go to a party at Simon's house or at Matthew's house? Nobody. Nobody who's a good religious person is going to go into a tax collector's home. It's filled with other tax collectors and
Higher up.
and women who are prostitutes, right? And so Jesus, of course, goes to the party. And all the scribes and Pharisees, the somebodies of the village, are outside looking in, going, even his own disciples, and even Simon Peter. Simon Peter is just livid in his boat. He comes to the doorway finally and watches Jesus. And Matthew's guests say, Jesus, tell us a story, because he's a good storyteller, right? And so Jesus goes on to tell the story in that setting of the lost sons. The prodigal son, but really the compassionate father. And Simon realizes, I've been like that second son who thinks I'm somebody, for Jesus going and finding this nobody. Yeah. And that's where the two reconcile, and Matthew becomes a follower of Jesus as well. Again, maybe not the way exactly it happened, but it's within the realm of thinking it did. Yeah. So he's the author. All right. Middle of fourth paragraph there. Nowhere does Matthew tell us in his gospel when he is writing. Right. In fact, if Matthew is in fact the author, then obviously it has to be written sometime within his lifetime and within the first generation of Christians after Pentecost. So it's got to be sometime from 30 AD, Pentecost, till the time that he would have no longer lived. So it's got to be somewhere between 30 and around 80 AD. Although we can't say for certain, it does seem likely that Matthew wrote before the war between Rome and the Jews. We know when that was, 66 AD to 70 AD. That was a long war. It was a 3-year siege of the city of Jerusalem. And the temple got destroyed finally in 70 AD. And we got to say, why would that be most likely before that? Well, let's take a look at some of the evidence. So let's look at Matthew 27 and then Matthew 28. So this is during Holy Week, Matthew's recording of Holy Week. Because Matthew, nowhere in Matthew's gospel does he write anything about the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Okay, so in 27:8, this is the follow-up of Judas. Of course, what does Judas do? He hangs himself. He betrays Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And when he realizes what he's actually done, he's convicted. And he tries to give the money back. And the chief priests, they say they don't want the money back. So let's read that. Let's actually start at verse 5. Somebody want to read that? Verse 5 through verse 8, please.
So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, "It is against the law to put this into the treasury, since it is blood money." So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this day.
Okay, so that last phrase, right? To this day. So it doesn't start until that event, that field becoming the burial place for traders, until this day. So that's kind of Matthew's just way of saying, hey, this is something common knowledge of what's just happened in our midst. So he's writing, obviously, after these events. Does that make sense? Okay. And then read verse 9, too. I didn't realize, but verse 9 kind of, we'll touch on that in a little bit.
Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 silver coins, the price set on him by the people of Israel.
To fulfill what? What the prophet
prophecy
Jeremiah.
had
Yeah,
said
the
30.
prophecy. So that's going to come out
30 silver coins.
10 times. Matthew's going to do that. This is one of the 10. Okay, so now skip over to chapter 28 again. And this is the story of after the resurrection. Right? The resurrection story of Jesus being raised from the dead. Matthew makes a few notes. Let's start at verse 11. And somebody want to read through verse 15, please.
While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day.
There's that same phrase, right? This is the story to this day that they keep telling. Okay? So those events happened in 30 AD. And the stories of the field and the stories of the bribery are keep being unfolding to this day. So he's referring to stuff that everybody would have been aware of that happened 30 years before. Okay? Now, we know that the destruction of the temple happened in 70 AD. The war started in 66 AD, 3-year siege, 4-year siege. And in his writing, he makes no mention of any of that happening to this day. So most likely, he's writing his gospel sometime before 66 AD. In fact, one of the other things that kind of led evidence to this is in Jesus teaching about the destruction of the temple, he prophesied it back in chapter 24. And Jesus said the days are going to come when all this is going to happen. And when it does, the people wish that they would never have been born. Well, when the news of the Roman armies started to come to siege the city, guess who left the city of Jerusalem before the siege actually happened?
The disciples, the believers.
The Christians, the believers. They left. They knew what was coming because of Jesus' prophecy. And they got out of the city. They remembered, yeah. So, best guess of when it was written, from all that little bit of evidence, I would say early 60s. About 30 years after the events, 30, maybe 35 years later, is when Matthew actually begins to write down the story that he remembers of the gospel, of what Jesus did, what Jesus taught. And as John mentioned one of the other days, in one of our Bible studies, what we liked, like the Sermon on the Mount, was he writing it down when Jesus was teaching it? Probably not. Yeah, but Jesus probably, we may mention that, like for the Sermon on the Mount, it's a lot. It's chapters 5, 6, and 7. It's all the teaching on. There's nothing in between it. Jesus probably used those elements of teaching in a lot of different situations. He probably, going from village to village, to synagogue, he probably has a standard stump sermon and teaching that he does, and that's probably what he's doing. And so they're hearing it over and over, right? And so for Matthew to recall it, the Holy Spirit's inspiration, he's reminding them of everything that Jesus did, yeah. So, all right, now the recipients. Who is he writing to? All right, so what kind of readers? Or better yet, I like that phrase, better yet, hearers, right? Who are the hearers? Why would he say that? Better readers, better than thinking about it as readers, the original audience was probably hearers. Why would he say that?
Hasn't been many copies and a lot of literacy.
Not a lot of literacy. One copy only to begin with, right? And then it got recopied, and it probably got circulated. But most people fear that it was probably written to be read aloud in church and worship. Yeah. It wasn't meant to be. They wouldn't have sat around in the Bible study like this. They would have all sat and listened to the story being read. It was meant to be orally delivered more than just to be read and studied. Right? Orally delivered.
Even in Martin Luther's time in Europe in the Dark Ages,
Right?
people, they just stood and somebody read it.
Yep, they read the story. And not many, like we said the other day, Luther didn't see his first Bible until he's 20 years old. All right, so who are the original audience? Most scholars, again, think that Matthew wrote his gospel to be read in church. That is, his intended audience was already Christian. Right? So these are Christians. And because Matthew includes so many quotations from the Old Testament, a lot of people think that his original hearers and audience that he had in mind were Jewish Christians specifically, more than Gentiles. Okay? Not that we can't read it as Gentiles, but the original audience was probably primarily Jewish Christians. And more than any other gospel writer, Matthew shows us how Jesus fulfills or completes the storyline of the Old Testament. And here's how he does it. 54 times, well, I think I got another quote here. There we go. 54 times Matthew cites something about the Old Testament. 54 times. 250 times he alludes to something about the Old Testament. That's a lot, right? And then 10 times, we read one of them in that passage about the blood field with Judas. 10 times he says this happened to fulfill what was written. Only Matthew does that formula, and he does it 10 times. That this is Jesus completing the storyline of salvation that began in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, with the call of Abraham and the formation of God's people to bring salvation into the world, and Jesus is fulfilling it. So let's take a look at some of those examples. Page 2.
They don't feel that Matthew was any more educated on
No.
the Old Testament.
Nope.
No.
Nope.
They all
Simon,
were-
oh yeah.
They all had gone to Hebrew school.
They knew the storyline.
They knew the stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of all
Because
of
it seems like he's really making an effort to like wrap it up and tie up, you know, tie it all
I think because of his
together.
audience.
More, yeah,
As
more,
Jewish Christians.
yeah, but more so than the others.
Well,
Why would that be?
If you're Luke, and you're a Gentile yourself,
Oh,
and you're writing not necessarily just to a specific audience of Jewish Christians, but to all Christians, they don't know that storyline.
that's what I
Yeah.
think I was getting at.
Yeah, they don't know that storyline quite as well. Yeah. Yeah. So let's take a look at a couple examples. So, Old Testament citations. Let's take a look. Let's start by going to Matthew chapter 4. What do we mean by citations? I'll give you an example. Chapter 4, verse 4. So this is in the temptation scene. We'll have this gospel reading in a couple of weeks on the first Sunday in Lent. Somebody want to read verse 4, and then verse 7, and then verse 10.
Jesus answered, "It is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God."
Verse 7.
Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test."
And then verse 10.
And Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only."
So these are examples of 3 citations of the Old Testament, right? And each time the Satan comes and the Satan tempts Jesus to do something, Jesus responds with, "It is written." And then he cites an Old Testament passage. Man shall not live by bread alone. That's Deuteronomy, right? Deuteronomy 6. When the Satan asks Jesus to throw himself from the temple, Jesus tempts Deuteronomy 8. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. That's actually written. That's cited in the Old Testament. And then finally, when the Satan asks Jesus to worship him, Jesus responds, "Away from me, be gone, Satan." Right? It is written. Man shall serve God only, which is again a Deuteronomy 8 passage. That's a citation. Well, skip over to Matthew chapter 5.
Is that supposed to scare the devil or represent the people?
I don't think it scares the devil. I think it's just it's the way of Jesus combating temptation, which teaches us.
So that's the Paul's having us that
It can teach us how to resist temptation too. Yeah. Knowing the scriptures is a good way of resisting temptation. Knowing what God's already taught us. So Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. Just as now, if you got a red letter Bible, these are all red letters. This is part of the Sermon on the Mount, right? What began, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven will." Jesus continues on for 3 chapters. So verse 21. Somebody want to read verse 21?
You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.
Okay. So you heard said long ago, do not murder. Well, where is that from? You shall not murder.
And
Exodus 20, one of the commandments. Yeah. Which is the citation of the Old Testament. Okay. Somebody want to read verse 27?
You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery.
Well, where'd you hear that?
Same place.
Same place. Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5. Same place, right? This is part of what's already cited in the Old Testament. Verse 31. Somebody want to read verse 31?
It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce.
Okay, where is that said? It's in Deuteronomy. Right? So he's citing. Jesus continues to cite the Old Testament. That happens 54 times in Matthew's Gospel. Because his audience probably are Jewish Christians who are very familiar with these texts and what is there. Okay. Now, what do we mean by allusions? 250 times Matthew is alluding to something about the Old Testament. Well, let's go back to chapter 3. This is something we looked at a little bit, but let's hone in on it a little bit more. So this is at the end of the baptism of Jesus story. Jesus has walked down to the water. John reluctantly dunks him into the water, and then the heavens are torn apart. The dove descends on Jesus, the Spirit, and then the voice says, verse 17. Somebody want to read verse 17?
And a voice from heaven said, "This is my son, who I love, with whom I am well pleased."
Very good, thank you. Again, the voice. Now, if you're a Jewish Christian, right, you know the storyline, you know these scripture passages. There's 3 allusions that what that voice is saying comes from the Old Testament story. This is my son. Psalm 2, verse 7. The coronation. When a king is coronated, God says, "This is my son." So that's an allusion. It's an echo of already what's in the Old Testament. The kings are called God's son. So when the voice is speaking, "This is my son," he's saying, "Here's your king. He's the son of David. There's your king." Okay? "This is my son whom I love, my beloved one." Well, that comes from the story of Genesis 22. That's the sacrifice of who? Abraham was called to sacrifice Isaac, his son, his only son, whom he loved. So Jesus is also not just a son of David, a king. This is an allusion, an echo of Jesus is also a son of Abraham, like Isaac was, a son that's loved. But this time, God will sacrifice that son. "With him I'm well pleased." That's an allusion, an echo of Isaiah 42, verse 1. Somebody want to skip back to Isaiah 42, verse 1?
Did all the army officers include that?
Nope, Isaiah.
Oh, Jeremiah.
Yeah, that's okay. I've memorized the Old Testament. I haven't. Did you know, though, that in order to be a university student in some countries, Islamic countries, they have to memorize word for word the Quran? Yeah, that's how they take their text pretty seriously. Isaiah 42, verse 1.
"Here is my servant who I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations."
There you go. This is my servant whom I love, whom I'm well pleased with, whom I delight in. So when the voice says, "This is my son," an echo, an allusion to the Old Testament. There's your king. Psalm 2, verse 7. My beloved one. Genesis 22, the son of Isaac, whom he loved. Isaiah 42, the servant of God, right? The one whom he's well pleased with. These are all echoes and allusions. Are you seeing that? Let's take a look at another example. Matthew chapter 11. So in Matthew chapter 11, we get John the Baptist, who is Jesus' forerunner, gets in prison, right? And at that moment, John begins to doubt. Is Jesus the guy, right? Is Jesus really the one? And he sends some of his disciples to go to ask Jesus. Matthew chapter 11, verse 3.
Are you really the one?
Are you really the one, or should we look for somebody else? Jesus replied, verse 4, "Go back, tell John what you have heard, what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me." So Jesus just says, go tell John what you're seeing, what's happening, and then he lists off these things. Well, that's an allusion to the Old Testament. Okay? What do I mean by that? Well, let's go. Let's take a look. Back to Isaiah. Go back to Isaiah chapter 35. I know a lot of Bible gymnastics today, right? You're going to find your way around pretty good. And we got Miss Dolores over there has got her little tabs. I wish I had those in mine.
35.
Isaiah 35. We're going to start at verse 4. Isaiah 35, starting at verse 4. And this is Isaiah talking about how there's going to be joy for those whom God redeems, and when he brings in the time of the Messiah. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save. So you may feel lost, but God's got you. He's going to come with the Messiah and get you. And then what will happen? The eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. The lame will leap like a deer, the mute tongue shout for joys. Waters will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. Does that sound like what we just read about Jesus' reply to John? Go tell John. Okay. Go to chapter 61 of Isaiah. Jesus said something about good news being preached to the poor as well. So Isaiah 61. Verse 1. Are you there? The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me. Sounds like being anointed, right? Because the Lord has anointed me to do what? To preach good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, to release from darkness those who are prisoners. What did Jesus tell John about, should we look for somebody else, or are you really the Messiah? He alludes to everything that was predicted in the Old Testament, that Isaiah prophetically saw and preached. What happened when the Messiah comes? An illusion. Got it. 254 times you could find different elements of that throughout the book of Matthew. One last thing then. 10 times Matthew will specifically say something happened to Jesus to fulfill what the prophets said. So let's take a look at two of them. Matthew 1, verse 21. These are words that we shared at Christmas time, right? So they're not unfamiliar to us. It actually should be 122. It should be 1 verse 22, not 21. My bad. You'll forgive me though, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, verse 22. Somebody want to read 22 and 23, please?
All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us.
So the virgin birth of Jesus that Matthew has just told us about was all done to do what? To fulfill
The prophecy.
what the prophet had said. And that prophet was Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. We're not going to go back and look at it. That's exactly what it says. Yeah, it exactly says the same thing. There's a fulfillment 10 times. And in the first 2 chapters, or the first 4 chapters, is where most of them happen. Most of them happen in the first 4 chapters. So there's another one. Let's take a look at the other one from Matthew chapter 2. So after the Magi come and visit Jesus, they're told in a dream to go by another way. And what does that do to Herod? It sets him off on his rampage of trying to execute Jesus. And Joseph is warned in a dream to take the child to go where? Flee to Egypt. And let's see how Matthew summates that. Why would he tell him to flee to Egypt? Somebody want to read chapter 2, verse 14 and 15.
So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son.
Which is Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. Out of Egypt I call my son. So Jesus is the Son of God. Israel was the Son of God. God called the people of Israel his son. And both of them got brought out of Egypt. Jesus is fulfilling the storyline of the Old Testament salvation story. 10 times. Who's the audience? Most likely Jewish Christians, the original audience, right? Okay. All right. So let's do one last thing. Let's look at the structure of Matthew. Big picture stuff. So I saw one summary this way. It's divided into, you can outline it into 3 parts. Chapters 1 through chapter 4, verse 16. This is the right after the temptation scene. This is an introduction of Jesus, right? So from chapter 1 through chapter 4, verse 16, introducing Jesus as the Christ, who's God's Son. And then part 2, starting at that moment after Jesus is baptized, after he comes out of the wilderness, he begins his ministry. Chapter 4, verse 17, and it says, from that time on, Jesus began to preach, to teach, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And that is his ministry, and it mainly happens in Galilee, and it starts with success. We heard that today, right? These big crowds come following after Jesus, but then it transitions through chapter 16, verse 20, into opposition. Okay? So Jesus starts his ministry, big success, huge crowds. Then we get to chapter 16, verse 20. Somebody want to look up that for me, please? That's probably the confession of St. Peter. Chapter 16, verse 20.
Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ.
Okay. So, in chapter 16, verse 20, this is the end of the confession of St. Peter. So, they go to a region called Caesarea Philippi, which is Gentile land, actually. And Jesus gets away from the crowds for the moment because now they're opposing him. And he asks the disciples, who do you say that I am? Right? Well, some say you're Elijah, a prophet. Who do you specifically? Simon says, you're the Messiah. You're the Christ. And from that time on, Jesus began to teach them what it means for him to be the Messiah. And what did Jesus say then in verse 20? So read that one again.
And he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ.
Don't tell anybody. I'm the Christ. And now that introduces us to the final stage in this outline, that Jesus is still going to have a ministry, but now it's the goal. And the goal is Good Friday and Easter. Because now everything from this point on, Jesus is heading towards Jerusalem. And he's going to keep repeating what's going to happen to him as they're journeying towards Jerusalem. And then it actually happens that last week of his life. Okay? That's one way that you could outline Matthew's gospel. Pretty simple, yeah.
Where Peter made that confession in Caesarea Philippi, that was right by where there was a bunch of altars where they sacrificed other gods.
Yeah. You were there?
Yes, I was
On your trip? Yeah.
And it's actually kind of a creepy place because they sacrifice babies and everything.
It is, yeah. So it was a city built in tribute to Caesar. And then the Philippi part, I think, was for Philip Herod. And it was a center of pagan worship. Yeah, yeah.
It was a fitting place.
Right. Neat. Thank you for sharing that. Yep. All right, so that's one outline. I'm going to go with this one. This actually, it's not bad. It's good. But it's simple, but I think there's more to it. I think that this is the structure of Matthew. And I got that then in the rest of our sheets here. Okay? So, the first, I think the first 4 chapters, like it's from 1:1 to 4:16, again, this is the introduction of Jesus. This is transitioning us from the Old Testament to the New Testament, right? So the infancy narratives of Jesus as a child, chapters 1 and 2. Then we get chapters 3, and then 4 through 16. We get the ministry of Jesus and John the Baptist kind of melding together, Old Testament and New Testament. But then 5 times in Matthew's Gospel, he says something like this. And when Jesus finished these sayings, so let's go to chapter 7. Go to Matthew chapter 7. And we're going to look at verse 28. So this is the end of the Sermon on the Mount. now it transitions from all red letters for 3 whole chapters. The last 2 verses are not red letters because Jesus isn't teaching anymore. This is Matthew's commentary. When Jesus finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority, not their disciples. Now, for us, okay, Jesus finished these sayings. Now imagine again, you are a listener to the gospel. You don't have a hard copy. You're only sitting there listening to it. If you're a good speaker, if you're a good speech giver, you want to give the listener little benchmarks. Because when you hear a phrase get repeated a couple times throughout a reading, that triggers what in your mind? Oh, I've heard this before. Oh, this might mean a transition. He's going to do something and tell something new.
He wants us to remember this.
Bingo. And he wants us to remember this because now he's changing the topic. Matthew does this phrase 5 different times. Okay? This was the first. Okay? Now go to chapter 11, verse 1. Now remember, all of our chapters and verses, by the way, Matthew never wrote that way. He never said, this is chapter 1 and verse 1. Those were all introduced years later by scribes and people who tried to put order to it. Matthew never would have done that. Okay? Somebody want to read chapter 11, verse 1?
After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee.
So now you're a listener only, right? You don't have a hard copy. You hear this phrase for the second time. Jesus finished saying these things, teaching these things. And then he transitioned on. That in your mind, as you're just listening, oh, we're transitioning to something here, right? Okay, let's see if there's another one. Well, there is. Chapter 13, verse 53. Chapter 11, verse 53. Somebody want to read that one, please?
When Jesus had finished these parables, he moved on from there.
He finished these parables. And what are parables?
Stories.
Stories and teachings,
They
right?
have a deeper message.
So there's a whole chapter, chapter 13, of Jesus telling stories, teaching through stories. And when he finished these teachings, then he moved on. Okay? That's the third time. Go to chapter 19. Chapter 18, if you look at chapter 18, a lot of red letters? A lot of red letters. It's Jesus teaching again, right? So, verse 19, or chapter 19, verse 1. Somebody want to read that one, please?
When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of the Jordan.
Fourth time. Jesus has finished saying things. Jesus has finished teaching things. And then he moves on. Fourth time. Again, imagine you're only a listener. You don't have the hard copy, no text. This is the fourth time. Oh, this is triggering something. This is a structure, intentional, that Matthew's using, okay? Last one, chapter 26, verse 1. And if you look at chapters 23, 24, and 25, if you got red letter Bibles, what do you see? You see a lot of red letters, right? A big teaching block of Jesus. Chapter 26, verse 1. Somebody want to read that one too again, please.
When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples.
Okay. So that's the fifth time. Jesus has, or Matthew has recorded, he said, hey, Jesus finished these sayings. Jesus finished these teachings. Jesus finished teaching in parables. And now he's moved on. Fifth time. That's a trigger, right? That should be a signal marker if you're just listening. Matthew's transitioning us to another part of the story. Okay? So that's what I mean by the structure of Matthew. He does that 5 times. All right, back to my notes. So some suggest that these 5 phrases are indicators of new sections. Like Matthew has structured his gospel along the lines of the 5 books of Moses. The Torah. This is a new Pentateuch. So if you're a Jewish believer, right, you've got your Old Testament, and the first 5 books are written by Moses. They're called the Torah. They divided the Old Testament scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, into 3 sections. The Torah, the books of Moses, 5 of them. the prophets from Judges through Malachi, and then the writings, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, Chronicles, Daniel, Esther, Ruth, Nehemiah. Those were all the writings. Okay? But the first 5 books of Moses were the key of it all, because he was the teacher sent by God. Now you got Matthew introducing Jesus, and he's saying, after Jesus finished these teachings, 5 times. This is, most believe that Matthew is structuring it on purpose this way, that we've got a new Moses here. Hey, Jewish Christians, got a new Moses. And he's introducing and teaching Jesus' story through these 5 main teaching blocks. Here's a big teaching, then it follows with a narrative. Here's a big teaching of Jesus. These would all be red letter sections, discourse number 2. There's then some narrative, stuff happens around it. Then Jesus teaches in parables for a whole chapter. And then some chapters of Jesus doing things, miracles, and weaving with people. And then finally another teaching of Jesus, chapter 18, all red letters, Jesus teaching. And then when he finished these, here's some stories. And then finally 2 chapters of Jesus teaching, introduced by, when he's done with this, here comes the final narrative of Jesus and what happens to him on Good Friday and on Easter.
He was crucified.
Yeah, right, he was crucified, yep. So that's kind of the structure of Matthew. Sound okay? All right. So I'm just going to read this next paragraph, middle of page 2. So the way each evangelist arranges his material says much about the message he wishes to convey. A thread which depicts the interplay between Jesus, the disciples, and the crowd runs through Matthew's account of Jesus unfolding his message and his ministry. It's surely not by accident that there are 5 stages in the attitude displayed by the crowds and his disciples, and that they coincide with the 5 books listed in Matthew's outline. So the first section is the kingdoms at hand. Big crowds. Disciples engaged, but big crowds. Top of page 3. He begins to focus on the lost sheep of Israel, right? He sends out the missionary teams just to go to the people of Israel to begin with, right? And the teachings are there in chapters 10, but then the narrative follows it. Then, in chapters 13 through 27, we get Jesus saying, I'm going to build my church. He teaches in parables, right? For a whole chapter about the kingdom. And then the narrative sections. And then the crowds begin to oppose Jesus. And Jesus in chapter 18 is going to teach, well, here's what my real people are. People who follow me, who live under my rule. They're my disciples. Old Israel will reject me. I've chosen 12 new disciples to be new Israel, who will follow me, and their teachings of me. And then finally, the last teachings come in chapters 24 and 26, or 25, and Jesus introduces the final victory, or Matthew introduces the final victory of Jesus that he brings into the world. There's a lot there, I know, big structure, but that's a way of understanding what Matthew's trying to do. All right, let's wrap it up. Page 4. There'll be a test next week.
On what?
This material. Yep. You'll have to memorize all 5 verses that Jesus said. Matthew 7:28, Matthew 11:1, Matthew. I can't remember. All right. So never mind. No test. All right. So last question: what does this structure convey to the hearers and the readers of this gospel? So what's Matthew trying to do? Why do we talk about this whole structure? Why might this be important? Well, here's why. Jesus was the Messiah, but not the popular Messiah of Jewish expectation. He was the humble Son of Man, the lowly Messiah, the friend of the poor, because he himself was poor. He renounced wealth and power, and he called on his disciples to do the same. He accomplished his final victory through his suffering and death. And that though the rule, or the kingdom of God, broke in with Jesus, it was not the rule of a warrior king Messiah ruling over Jewish world empire after subduing the surrounding nations. That was the goal of the people of his time. Right? Rather, the rule of God, the kingdom of God, demonstrated itself in submission to the will of God. the truths about Jesus' messiahship emerged against the backdrop of Jewish unbelief and hostility. As Jesus' ministry progressed and his meaning became increasingly clear, old Israel turned on him. They rejected all that he stood for. However, Jesus gathered some out of old Israel, his 12 disciples, matching the 12 tribes of Israel, right? His 12 disciples he calls to himself, and he molds them and shapes them into his own new people, a new and true Israel. Entwined in this thread is the conviction that Jesus is a new Moses who forms the new and true Israel, rescues it from the bondage to Satan, sin, and death, instructs it, bestows on it the new and the true Pentateuch. Pentateuch is the word for the first 5 books of Moses. And he leads it into the true inheritance of eternal life. And claim to membership in the people of God, then, does not rest on national ties or rituals rightly performed. You don't got to be a Jew, an Israelite, circumcised on the 8th day, but it relies on faith in and allegiance to the true Son of Man, the Savior of all the world and all the peoples, and the King of all creation. There you go. So, that's what we'll start with next week. Taking a look at how that unfolds in chapter 3, looking at the story of Jesus and John. And we'll go pretty fast.
You were talking about the opposition at one time,
They tried to throw him in Luke, up in his own synagogue. They didn't try to stone him, they tried to throw him off the cliff. Yeah. But yeah, they tried to kill him.